So, were you successful? Let's have a look at my solution together. The first task was to create two new components. One manually and with the CLI maybe. So I will start with the first one, which I'll create manually. I will create a new folder and I will name it warning alert. And in there I will create a new file, which I'll name warningalert.component.ts, following this naming convention I explained. Now in this TypeScript file, I will export a class, which I'll also name warning alert component, again following this convention of being descriptive about what's in it. Here I will add the component decorator, and as you learned, the component decorator needs to be imported, so we should import component from @Angular core like this. With that import added, we need to configure the component so that Angular is able to do something with it. We absolutely need to add a template, and we should also add a selector here so that we are able to use it. Now the selector could simply be app warning alert, again to have a unique selector. And the template, you could point to an external file or use an inline template. For this component, I will use an inline template, though of course you are free to choose an external file. And I will simply, between backticks here, create a multi-line string where I have a paragraph in which I say, this is a warning, you are in danger, whatever text you like. This is my first component for now. Now I will create the second component with the CLI. So in the terminal, I can create a new one by writing ng generate component, or as I told you, the shortcut gc. And now this will be the success alert. So success alert will be the name. This will give me a success alert folder with all these files. I don't need the spec file, the testing file here. So we'll remove it. And now in this folder here, we got a out of the box working TypeScript file. We got a HTML file. As a side note, you can't ignore this constructor and ng on init thing. I will come back to this later. And here I want to output another message where I say, you are so successful maybe. This is my success message. So with that, both components are created. I also already added their templates, the content of the templates. Now we should output them beneath each other here in the app component. So I'll do this right below this paragraph, maybe add a horizontal line to separate them. And then I'll add the app warning alert component and the app success alert component. And now if we save this, we will get an error. So now is your chance to anticipate this error and fix it, but I will show you which error it is in a second. So I'll save this, and let's now go to our presumably working application where we, oh guess what, find an error. So what's wrong? Let's have a look at the error message. Most error messages are kind of useful in Angular, that's a good thing. And here it says that app warning alert is not a known element. Isn't that strange? Because warning alert, this selector here, I can copy it so that I don't have a typo. If I now paste this in there, doesn't look like I had one, so it should be known. Nope, we forgot one important thing. App module, we have to add it there. The success alert component was added automatically since we used the CLI, but our warning alert component, well, we have to add it on our own. So we should add warning alert component here, and I could use my IDE to auto import it, but for this time I will type the import manually. So warning alert component should be imported from, and now we should point to our warning alert folder and there to the warning alert.component file without .ts at the end. Now with this in place, now if you go back to the application, now we see this is a warning, you are in danger or you are so successful. So now we can see both components. So we finished these tasks here. Now let's style them appropriately. So maybe a little box with a red background for the warning and with green for the success case. So for the warning alert, I'm again going to use inline styles to have everything inlined here to show how this works. So I'll add my styles array, and in there I'll add backticks to be able to write a multi-line style. And I basically want to style my paragraph, which is the only element I have in here. So this paragraph now should receive some padding, maybe 20 pixels, and a background color of, let's search for red, or maybe some misty rose, something like that. It's a light red touch, choose any color you want. And maybe also let's give it a border of 1 pixel solid and a solid red color. If I save this, we should now see, looks like a warning alert box, looks fine to me. Now let's copy this for our success box, but here I'm going to use the external file, which is already referenced in the TypeScript file here. So let's add it here. Let's turn this to some light green, maybe green yellow, or do we have something pale green maybe? And then use a clear green here for the border. And now we should see 2 boxes below each other, 1 green, 1 red, depending on the component, with our own style added. So with that, all tasks are completed. This was the first little assignment to play around with components and get into how to create them, how to style them, how to work with them. Let's dive deeper into the basics of Angular in the next lectures. In our little basic first application we're working on, where we added a couple of components, we covered a lot of key aspects of a basic Angular app, how it starts and how to use components, the base building block of any Angular app. But thus far, we only output static content, the server component here. That's not super interesting. We did even more than that in the first section of this course. So let's change this to output some data which is kind of dynamic at least, which is not hard-coded into the template. Time for some data binding. What is data binding? You could basically translate data binding with communication. Communication between your TypeScript code of your component, your business logic, and the template, so what the user sees. Because you might have some result in your TypeScript code because you fetched something from a server or finished some calculation, which you want to display to the user. And the only thing the user sees is the template. So we need some kind of communication between both pieces to be able to really, do something in our app. That is where data binding comes into play because it is responsible for this communication. We get different ways of communication now. For example, we want to output data from our TypeScript code in the HTML code, in the template. We can use string interpolation for this. You saw this in the first section of the course. It's the syntax with the double curly braces and then some property name or some expression in between. Or property binding. We'll have a closer look at all these forms, of course, in the next lectures. So we will learn what this then is and how it works. The syntax basically uses these strange squared brackets around HTML attributes. But again, I will come back to this. Sometimes, though, the other direction is interesting too. If the user clicks a button, you can kind of think of the user clicking this button on the template because again, the template is the thing with which the user interacts, which he sees and where he's also able to click buttons. So if we click a button, we maybe want to trigger something in our TypeScript code. So now we need the other direction. And we can get this other direction. We can react to user events with event binding. So we can bind to, for example, a click event to execute some code whenever it occurs. And we also have one additional form of data binding where we combine both directions. Two-way data binding, where we are able to react events and output something at the same time. Might not be super clear how this works, but that is why we will now have a detailed look at all 4 forms in the next lectures. Let's start by having a closer look at string interpolation. Here in the server component, I don't want to output this here in the HTML code like this. I don't want to hard code the output here. It would be realistic that our server component contains information about a specific server. So maybe here in the template file, we want to output server with ID and then some dynamic ID here and then the status like offline. So we have two dynamic fields here. Now, it would make sense to kind of derive them in TypeScript code. In a real app, that might be derived from a HTTP request you make to some backend or some calculation. For now, I will hard code it in here. So we might have a server ID, and I will assign a value of, let's say, 10, so a number. And I might also have a server status, which is a string offline. So two different types, a string and a number. And though not necessary, you could also be very explicit by assigning the type with TypeScript's feature here of adding a colon after the property name and then the type. It will infer it automatically though, so this is not required. I'm just doing this here for demo purposes. So now I want to output these two properties in my template. And to get this connection, we need data binding, because you learned it's all about the communication between your TypeScript code and the template. So string interpolation is a typical use case here, or a typical solution for this task here. Instead of the placeholder, I use my double curly braces, opening and closing. This is the string interpolation syntax. And in between these double curly braces, you can now write a TypeScript expression. So the easiest expression is to simply reference a property, like the server ID. And this is a common use case, that you only output a property here, or the value of the property. However, it's not the only use case. You could also, for example, here for server, simply hardcode a string in there. Any expression which can be resolved to a string in the end. That's the only condition for a string interpolation syntax here. So whatever you have between the curly braces, in the end it somehow has to return a string. So you could also call a method here which returns a string in the end. The only other restriction is you can't write multi-line expressions here. You can't write block expressions in here. So you can't add a if or a for control structure in here. You could use a ternary expression though. So this is what you can do. Now let's also replace the last placeholder, and here I will again just reference a property, the server status. Now this is string interpolation in usage, and you see that we have an expression which is a string itself, and then two other expressions which simply point to properties. And again, you could also call a method here which returns a string. Now interesting, the server ID is not a string but a number. And I just said that string interpolation has to resolve to a string in the end, has to get a string in the end. So let's see if this works. If we save this with ngserve still running, let's also change app server back to app servers to make this work again. We see server with ID 10 is offline. We see it twice because we repeat this component, and each component of course has the same content, but we see that string interpolation is working and that it especially is also working here for our number. So ID 10, that is not an issue, that is working fine, because a number can be easily converted into a string. So yes, you have to get a string in the end, or something which can be converted to a string to really be correct here. This is how you can use string interpolation. And now to really complete the example, let's say the server status here is somehow returned in a method. Get server status could be the method name. This is how you define a method in TypeScript. So you might know this kind of method definition from other languages. And here we simply return this server status. So we return the property here. We could of course have accessed as it directly, as we already did, but just to demonstrate that you can call a method, here I am calling a method. Get server status of course leads to the same output, because again all this method does is it returns us a string in the end, or something which can be converted to a string. That is string interpolation in action.